Is climate change for real? I try not to think about it. Is climate change for real? I try not to think about it. Okay, I'll think about it. Nope, it's not for real. Well, you may be in denial. No, I'm not in denial. It's got to be a Chinese hoax. It must be. I don't like your solution, so it can't be true. Isn't the climate always changing? If it gets too bad, God will intervene. You may be in denial. Is climate change for real? Okay, yes. Next question. Are we fucked? I try not to think about it. Are we fucked? I try not to think about it. Are we fucked? Well, not quite yet, but we are definitely in a climate emergency, and we need to start acting like it now. Which obviously begs the question, well, can we fix it? Let's hold off on that and come back to understand better, what do we mean by yet? Are we fucked yet? Because some people are already experiencing the deadly impacts of climate change now, while others, due to geography or privilege, won't be feeling the worst of things for a while yet to come. So are we fucked? Well, what do we mean by we? And this is possibly the most important question in the entire flowchart, because there are many we's. Folks are having very different experiences of climate change. Some folks think, I'm going to escape to a nice farm in Vermont with my friends, while others, very validly, are saying the apocalypse is already happening to me, and I can't help but think about it. Let's follow the pathway of these folks who think they can get away to Vermont with their friends. Why do they think that? Because the hidden assumption is the apocalypse is going to happen to somebody else. Well, who? Well, that would be what we call people who are on the front lines of climate impacts. Frontline communities experience first and worst the consequences of climate change. We are disproportionately low income, of color, indigenous, from the global south, and folks who labor in toxic conditions. So that's frontline communities having a very different experience than the folks with enough sort of privilege and access to be able to kind of pop off to Vermont, who, even though they believe the science, are in emotional denial about the widespread consequences and who will be most impacted and how this will play out for everybody. And possibly also not just an emotional denial, but possibly a bit racist. But it is complicated, but possibly a bit racist nonetheless. Shit. So what can I do? Well, one thing you can do is leverage your privilege, to address the problem while trying not to virtue signal too hard about it, people. Okay. But even if we're putting our privilege to work to tackle the climate emergency, does this therefore mean we're all in this together? Not. Because as we've already seen, folks on the front lines of climate impacts who are being clobbered by floods and droughts and fires, or who are being poisoned or dispossessed by extractive industries, are objectively not all in this together with folks who have more privilege and who can use that privilege to buffer themselves to those impacts. And frontline communities were taking the position, rightfully, that nothing about us without us, which basically means, if a disaster preparedness plan is being crafted, then frontline communities, we want to be at that table. And our situation, our particular vulnerabilities should be first and foremost in the crafting of that plan. If systemic solutions to the root causes of climate change are being crafted, then we want to be part of that conversation because we have sort of an essential first-hand experience in the problem and a unique perspective on how to solve it and address it in a just manner. Which brings us back once again to the question. So, are we all in this together? Well, it's complicated because our polycrisis is also a crisis of forced migration, of race, of capitalism. And these are going to play out in very uneven ways, depending on where you're situated in that crisis, your level of privilege and level of vulnerability. So the more accurate answer to are we all in this together would be a considered sorta, and you could say that yes, we're in the same storm, we share the same macro biosphere, the same planet, but we are in very different boats, depending on where we are located or where we fall in this hierarchy of privilege and vulnerability. We are going to have a very different and very unjustly distributed experience. So we're in the same storm, but different boats. And because we are in a climate emergency, we have to start acting like it. So for all of these reasons, we need to ask the question, can we fix it? Well, I try not to think about it. Can we fix it? I tried to think about it. All right, but we must. So can we fix it? And that depends on two things, two major sort of conceptual, where do we think we are type of things. What kind of problem is it that we're in? And what are we in the crisis of? All right, let's take this first one. Are we in a usual kind of problem, like one that we're familiar with, a technical fix, or as Rex Tillerson, the ex-CEO of Exxon and Donald Trump's long-suffering for a short while Secretary of State would argue, climate change is an engineering problem and it has engineering solutions, which would mean that we are in a sort of familiar kind of problem. But most people think it's much more complicated and multifaceted than that. And in fact, there's a term for it, a wicked problem. That's what the sociologists and social theorists have come up with, a wicked problem. Well, you might wonder, what is a wicked problem? And here we come to one of the definitions in the flowchart. A wicked problem is a problem that 1, you can't define, 2, never ends, 3, has no right answer, i.e. no agreed upon optimum solution across all the stakeholders, is unique, i.e. so damn special that no previous problem serves as a good guide and is itself a symptom of other problems, potentially other wicked problems. Whoa. And because climate change is so gnarly, the social theorists have come up with a whole new term for it, because in this case, those seeking to solve the problem are also causing it, and time is running out. So climate change has a whole separate category that had to be invented to describe it, a qua problem, and that is as a super wicked problem. And if you're from Boston, that's like a super wicked problem, which means we're not in a problem, we're actually in a predicament, which is a very different kind of situation, because as one would expect, you can't, at least in the normal way we think of fixing problems, you can't fix a predicament. Okay. So that brings us back to this root question of, can we fix it? And of course, we don't want to think about it, but we are thinking about it. So can we fix it? And that also depends on what are we in a crisis of. And of course, I try not to think about that either. But one answer, one simple answer that we've sort of highlighted or foreshadowed earlier is that we're in a crisis of just one thing, carbon, the lifeblood of industrial civilization. If that were true, then once again, we're in this simple engineering problem type of situation. But most people, and I would agree after much reading and thought and engagement with the problem, that we are in a crisis of much more than just carbon. We're in a crisis, a poly-crisis as it's called, of food, water, health, biodiversity, forced migration, race, capitalism, democracy, even masculinity, as well as, of course, industrial civilization and all the stories and habits of mind that we've developed around that, including our imagination, our sort of notion of what's real or possible, and even sort of how we experience being alive, what we sense is real, ontology. So we're in a crisis of all of that. And so arguably our ecological crisis is actually a crisis of everything else. And this eventually leads us to the question, how bad is it? Of course, I try not to think about it. Many of us. How bad is it? I try not to think about it. Well, once we start thinking about it, we seem to have 4 options, which might explain why we try not to think about it, because those 4 options are baddish, pretty bad, really bad, and really, really bad. Let's take the baddish, the least terrible option. It assumes that we might be in for a business as usual kind of scenario, but as Kevin Anderson, climate scientist from Britain at the Tyndall Institute would tell you, and I think accurately, we have no non-radical futures left. Climate change is coming. It's going to radically unravel. It's a radical reckoning of one kind or another. So we either sort of let it happen to us, or we face it and navigate it forward in the best possible way. There is no such thing as business as usual anymore. So that option is off the table.
Du vågst få a better catastrophe go to https oder flowchart. Better Catastrophe, calm.